I'd like to start with the skipper's business land acknowledgement. School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies acknowledges that it's located on the ancestral land, indigenous nations. Thank the Native community and the Salt River Valley, including the Chimal Ocean, Chimal people, Upas, Maricopa people, nations who have inhabited this place for centuries, and whose stewardship of the land and waterways allow us to be here today. Emphasizing land acknowledgements alone are not enough. Is committed to supporting our Native students' community by promoting learning Indigenous histories, philosophy, and religion. Creating a learning environment where Native students succeed and thrive in collaborating with Indigenous nations and the region to protect Native sovereignty, governance, jurisdictions, and territory. So I'd like to do some thank yous to that's not happened. Behind them, I'd like to everyone who made this possible, supported this event, Skipper's Anti-Racism Committee, who on this started this event. Also AFU Jewish Studies, who also started this event. Also Robert Peterson, the Director of Jewish Studies. Thank you to you as well. Racism Committee. You're going to go. These events, really nothing happens around here without our amazing staff, and they make academic unit really the central node. Special thank you again, cleaning up all my messes all the time. Organize my disorganization. I'm always indebted to you, so thank you. Ron Delgado, Julia Taylor, Lisa Kaplan from Jewish Studies, as well as Kristen K. Udget and Gloria Baker. I'd like to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Professor Doris Bergen. I'll be giving a timely and important talk this afternoon. Antisemitism, anti-Black racism, and misogyny are linked. It's Black History Month, February. It's Black History Month. So, and we just finished observing International Holocaust Remembrance Day last week on January 27th. Of course, the ongoing and worsening political climate in the current moment, which is all the more important, as we confront and grapple with the persistent destructive patterns and violent legacies of white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, sexual racism in general, and misogyny in the misogyny. So Professor Bergen is a special person to me. We're both Western Canadians. We connected that way in Toronto. Neither of us like the rain in Toronto. We grew up in a dry climate, much like here. But Professor Bergen really changed the direction of my doctoral work, my dissertation, and my career trajectory. Professor Bergen was also my teaching mentor at University of Toronto. He used to sit in on your courses and really learn how to teach. And we get a lot of mileage out of that here. I'm the associate teaching professor, teaching lots of classes on religion and violence, religion and genocide, nationalism, ethnic conflict. So reason to teach for that. And so, Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolf Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Toronto. Research focuses on religion, gender, ethnicity in the Holocaust and World War II, and really have been a pioneer. National Book Prize this past year. So that's quite the accomplishment. Lots of flowers. Professor Bergen held international grants and fellowships at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the German Marshall Fund, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, as it's so affectionately called. And the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. He's a member of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. And one other, I just got the 4th edition of this book. I think anybody who's taught Holocaust before has used this book in one of the editions. Keep getting bigger. There's 9 copies of those. Nice to have a 4th edition, which I believe is maybe the last one. So keep on coming out, and there are many people who are kind of familiar with it. Without further ado, I will go on to Professor Doris.
Thank you so much, Tim, for the really warm and personal introduction. And let me just check, how is the sound? Sound is okay? And online sound? Ronnie is okay? Okay. Thank you. I too want to thank all the organizers, because I know these events take a lot of effort. And I want to thank all of you for being here today. A few extra words of thanks. I want to thank Imani Brown, the artist who designed my slides, and 2 research assistants, Jessica Bush and Camilla Collins-Ariza. Special thanks to my 9 readers. You're going to hear from them in the audience. So it feels important and even urgent. Be here, as Tim mentioned, at the start of Black History Month, and just a few days after marking International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And to be commemorating, I guess, these times designated for learning, remembering, and aspiring together, the same event. They're not the same. There are also asymmetries. For instance, I had hoped at my talk to be able to advertise the upcoming talk of my friend and colleague, Professor Melanie Newton, a distinguished historian of the Caribbean, who is going to be speaking here on Saturday. Professor Newton is not coming for this talk. And thinking about her reasons for cancellation, I was so struck by how the risks for her traveling now are really different. I didn't face those risks. So yeah, I wanted to say that up front. So my topic, how anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and misogyny are linked. Short answer is many ways. So my talk is quite complex. Material is intense and often distressing. So I made a bit of a roadmap to help you follow along through all the twists and turns and the different points that I want to address. So let's start with point 1, which is talking about a goal with this talk and more generally my practice in the field of Holocaust studies. My goal is really to try, in this moment of crisis, moment of sharp divisions, including in the field of Holocaust studies, to try to hold open the field. Not the only one thinking this way, to try to hold open an approach to Holocaust study and commemoration that is capacious, that has the possibility for multiple positions, that invites people to make connections, that hears the cries of people who suffer all over the world, cries of Israeli women raped by Hamas, cries of people in Gaza bombarded, hungry, mourning, the cries of people here and now in our own communities for poverty, injustice, cruelty. An approach that is open to look and listen and learn. trying to be open, I think, also means being willing to change our minds, to see other perspectives. And a really good example, I think, of this sort of openness comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American historian, public intellectual, who in 1949 reported on what he learned from his visits to the site of the destroyed Jewish ghetto in Warsaw. To hear these words out loud, we have Anna.
Of my view of the Warsaw Ghetto is not so much clear understanding of the Jewish problem in the world as it was real and more complete understanding of the Negro problem. The first place, the problem is slavery and supremacy past in the United States is no longer in my mind a separate human thing as I have so long conceded. It is not even solely a matter of color, physical and racial characteristics. This was particularly a hard thing for me to learn. For a lifetime, the color line has been a real and efficient religion. It is not merely a matter of religion. The base pattern in which it is emphasized cut across the lines of color, belief, status is a matter of cultural patterns, where the teaching of human hate and prejudice, all sorts of because in this ghetto of Warsaw appears to emerge from a certain social provincialism into a broader conception of what the fight against race segregation, religious discrimination, the oppression by wealth, and to become civilization is going to triumph.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reading. So this brings us already to the second point, thinking about layers of current moments. 10 years ago, in 2015, the Holocaust Education Week in Toronto had a theme of Holocaust and now. Trying to prepare a talk on that theme got me thinking about how the layers of what I think is so often referred to as this current moment shape the present. There are so many of those current moments in the past decades, but let me just draw your attention to a few of them. Probably many of you recognize that photo, of course, from Charlottesville in 2017. The white supremacists held a violent and deadly rally against removal of Confederate statues. At that time, so many people contacted me, so upset, saying they're shouting Nazi slogans. Remember the slogan, Jews will not replace us. At the time I was confused. It's not a Nazi slogan. There are many, many, many Nazi slogans. It's not one of them. It did not, however, take long for me to find the origins of that slogan. It's an anti-immigrant slogan from Europe. And the slogan is actually, you will not replace us. I thought about it turned into, Jews will not replace us. I thought, I can't prove this. Imagine the scenario. You have a column of people marching and shouting, carrying a swastika flag. People further back in the column, maybe they didn't know that slogan, you will not replace us. They see the swastika and they hear, Jews. And it makes sense to them. I was thinking that mistake, like that children's game of telephone, right, actually carried within it an important truth about the intertwining of anti-Black racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Semitism. A year later, shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh of Jews at prayer, so made me think about interconnections, because that synagogue was an important hub of refugee relief activity. Since then, there have been so many other moments, and I just listed a few, the Christchurch mosque shootings, killing of George Floyd. I can add many more. I've been thinking about the shifting patterns spirals of anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, transphobia, anti-Asian racism. And we could have a whole series of talks called anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism pushing, pulling, feeding on, fed by racisms. Each specific, each itself mutating in its context, also linked. I have to say, since October 7th, it's harder to talk about those links in the field of Holocaust studies. But I think it's all the more substantial. Let's already go to the third point about ideological linkages, or what I called there for shorthand, anti-Semitism as glue. What I mean here about how clusters of hatreds are often bound together or fastened together with familiar anti-Jewish concepts. It's articulated in a horribly concise way. And this text, which is the manifesto, that some of you will remember this event in 2019, German man went to a synagogue in Halle, bent on killing Jews. When he got there, the security doors of the synagogue held. He couldn't get in. So he turned to the street. He just shot a woman passing by, went to a Turkish restaurant and shot a customer there. And his manifesto, written in English, said these sentences, quote, "I think the Holocaust never happened. Feminism is the cause of declining birth rates in the West, which acts as a scapegoat for mass immigration and the root of all these problems." You can hear it all there, right? Wrapped up in one package. Anti-Semitism in this form of glue can show certain core characteristics. It's reactive, always mixed with other hatreds and prejudices, drawing on them. It's adaptive, based on vague categories that can always be made to fit. I gave some examples, the conspiracy theories, metaphors of the parasite and the germ. Thrives on contradictions. Jews as both somehow strong and weak, impotent and lecherous, inferior and wildly popular. And if you think about it, those qualities, maybe they characterize all longstanding prejudices, like anti-Black racism. This entanglement, you try to kind of think about an image or a symbol to capture it. The best I've come up with so far is the idea of a dust ball, something that moves through time and space. It's always changing. It's always kind of the same too, right? It's gathering, it's losing as it goes. You think it's gone, it turns up somewhere else. This dust ball entanglement, picking up from the detritus around it. These entanglements, anti-Semitism intermeshed with anti-Black racism and other hatreds. It's nothing new. You can see it articulated also actually in Hitler's Mein Kampf. I don't want to read this one out loud, but you can see there the way that Hitler's statement literally weaponizes fears of the sexual threat, the idea of somehow the Jew as the puppeteer pulling the strings behind Black men, somehow depicted as just the tools, Jewish manipulation, the bodies of white women threat. You can see the misogyny woven in there too, right? The idea that women, even of the in-group, are somehow weaklings who are going to open floodgates, the supposed tainted blood. This mixture of disgust, fear, sexualized images of both men and women is really a staple of Nazi anti-Jewish propaganda. You can see it in this and many images. And in the Nazi era too, it often blurred into anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-communist prejudices. This poster from 1942, so in the midst of the war, I think is really a powerful illustration of this intermingling The top line, of course, says "Onward, Christian Soldiers," right? A familiar Protestant Christian hymn. And underneath the banner says, "This is how they look, Christian soldiers." With pictures of Soviet soldiers, Red Army soldiers. Underneath the smaller writing also brings, I think, a really important hallmark of anti-Semitism, what I call the inversion. It says there are bestial, murderous acts. Lemberg, Riga, Vilno, and Dubno have filled the world with disgust and outrage. All of those places listed, Ziv, Riga, Vilna, Dubno, they were all sites of German massacres. But this move, accusing the enemy of one's own crimes and claiming a terrain of victimhood, a really standard hallmark in enduring systems of prejudice. The question of how to talk about sexualized racist propaganda is actually quite a serious one that grappling with right now. Like, how do you talk about this material without reproducing it, right? How do you bring those issues forward without in some way giving them a certain power? How do you analyze them with empathy and an eye to their victims? The image on the right comes from the Nazi journal Der Stürmer, of course depicting the Jewish man as a sexual predator, using Christian imagery, also drawing on images familiar from lynchings of Black men in the United States. Such depictions, this kind of heady mix, both visual and verbal, are being used right now around us. Don't have to look far to the past. Chose that one actually from a few years ago, from a Polish magazine, again showing that weaponization of sexual threats, supposed of the enemies in these systems. Sexuality of the others is portrayed as a threat. White Christian men's ownership over women's bodies, their place at the top of the hierarchy. Now the next point, point 4, it's so obvious, it doesn't need to be said, but I say it anyways. Perceiving these linkages is so important, but they're most likely to be recognized precisely by the people with the most experience. Again, it's obvious, but let me just explain what I mean. So this point was really struck home to me last year when I went to visit the National Memorial of Peace and Justice in Montgomery, often referred to as a lynching memorial. I'm curious how many people here in the room have been there? Need to go. It's a phenomenal memorial, very powerful. And the core idea is that there are granite blocks suspended at different heights, each of them with the name of someone who was killed in a lynching. By the way, I was surprised how many women were included there as well, maybe a quarter of the people lynched were women. So each block has a person's name, it has the county where the killing occurred, and it has the dates. When was the person born? When was the date that they were murdered? Looking through those, I was struck by how often the date 1933 showed up, the year that Hitler came to power. When I got back to my computer, I looked it up, and sure enough, between 1932 and 1933, the number of lynchings increased by a factor of 4. Not only that, some of these have and other examples you can see as well. Was it a coincidence? I don't know. African-American observers at the time, many of them commented on the connection to Hitler's power and anti-Jewish measures in Germany. For instance, the Howard University professor Kelly Miller wrote about, quote, the striking analogy between the legal manifestations of race prejudice against the Negro in America and the Jew in Germany. I found many such statements of recognition. Black writers who condemned Nazi persecution of Jews called out the hypocrisy of their white neighbors. The white people listening. One of the privileges of power is that systems of domination hide themselves from the people who benefit. This is why we need to listen to the people who are targeted and violent. So it's not simply here in the United States, but more broadly, that people at the time in the Nazi era recognized global linkages. For instance, the Martinican politician and poet Aimé Césaire, the speech given in 1945, months after the war ended, articulated those connections in lines that almost read like a poem. Jason will read it for us.
I turn on my radio. I hear that blacks have been lynched in America. I say that we have been lied to. Lur is not dead. And I turn on my radio when I learn that Jews have been insulted and mistreated. Finally, I turn on my radio and hear that in Africa, forced labor has been inaugurated and legalized. I say that we have certainly been lied to. Lur is not dead.
Power of looking through the eyes of people targeted by violent systems, of reversing the gaze, is demonstrated by the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison in an interview she gave analyzing power dynamics, work, and racism. Ava is going to read this one for us.
Don't you understand that the people who do this thing, practice racism, are bereft? There is something distorted about the psyche. It's a huge waste. It's a corruption. It's a distortion. It's a profound neurosis that nobody examines for what it is. What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? Still smart? Do you still like yourself? If you can only be tall because someone is on their knees, then you have a serious problem.
In that line, such an important one, if you can only be tall because someone's on their knees, you have a serious problem. Thinking about these dynamics of power, I think help us understand why it's no surprise that sexual violence is built in systems of domination. This photograph, Jewish women literally on their knees in the so-called undressing barracks, surrounded by members of a German killing squad, police battalion 101, which illustrates something that's dynamic. See this picture as a scene of rape, even if the men still at that moment have their pants on. And in the Nazi system, contrary to the image of Nazis as somehow distanced from their victims, rape was also very common, including rape of Jewish women, tested to in many accounts, like this account from Laura Varon, an Auschwitz survivor. Subject of sexual violence in the Holocaust has been the study of a number of really excellent works. Recently, showed two of them there by Regina Mulhauser and Edward Esterman. And it's also been elucidated by comparative frame, thinking comparatively with other cases of genocide and mass violence. For instance, the scholar Leanne Fuji coined the phrase violent display, analyze public displays of violence and lynching, and again, the ubiquity of sexual forms of humiliation and domination in those systems. Untangling these horrific topics requires what I call reversing the gaze, looking back at perpetrators through the eyes of their targets and victims. One of the images I like to use for this, reversing the gaze and teaching, is this painting by the German Jewish artist Charlotte not herself, survived the Holocaust, who painted her, you could say, view the day Hitler came to power, again, reversing the look through her eyes rather than looking at her as a Jew through Nazi eyes. Juxtaposing Solomon's image, the quote from Toni Morrison, and with Abraham Joshua Heschel's remark, racism is a sickness of the racist, eye disease, cancer of the soul. Let's go to point 5. Another way that anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and misogyny are linked to the maybe obvious, easily forgotten fact of people live those links, experience them on their own bodies, intersecting, overlapping identities. And I just want to give a couple of examples, starting with the example of Jews in North Africa. And again, some of you know a lot about this. During World War II, there were about 100,000 Jews in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Libya. The Holocaust reached those places too. Mostly in the field of Holocaust studies, North Africa is a neglected subject, although there's some excellent scholars working on it. I give 2 examples here, Omar Boum and Sarah Stein. Now, many North African Jews would not describe themselves and would not have described themselves as Black. In the context of the war, Germans certainly described them that way, and so did the Ashkenazic Jews that they encountered. Consider the fate of about 2,000 Libyan Jews who were rounded up, put into camps, first in Libya, and sent to Italy, then on to Germany, where a number of them ended the war in Bergen, Belsen. The most detailed look at this group of people that I know of comes from the novel depicted here by Yossi Sukari, based on, so it's a novel written as fiction. It's based on the experiences of his grandmother and his mother, Libyan Jews, who went through exactly that Benghazi, Bergen-Belsen trajectory in the title. The main character of the book, Silvana, modeled on Sukari's mother, is a young woman near the end of the war in Bergen-Belsen. She was raped, not by Germans, but by Dutch prisoners. In the novel, Silvana describes her sense of abandonment in the silencing. Didn't resist, she wrote, she says, she did not tell anyone because who would help her? SS, other prisoners, white Jewish brothers, Sukari writes, treated her like an animal, had cunningly managed to invade their territory. Closing part of the book, a kind of, you could say, scene of rejoining Jewish community. Silvana describes how at first she did not join in the singing of Hatikva, although she knew the words. Quote, only when she realized that the song was coming to an end, she joined in, emphasizing her Arab accent. So they would all know to in there. Another intersecting category that I think is really rewarding to contemplate is the category of Black victims of Nazism. Subject 2 is not well integrated into Holocaust studies as a whole, but there is some interesting work that's been done. The book by Clarence Luzon, published in 2002, Luzon, a professor at Howard University, very important work, but rarely cited in the field. Even more obscure is the novel, also a work of fiction on the right, by the French Martinican writer Michel Maillet. Like Sukari, based the book on fragments of historical evidence, in this case, a fragment of the diary of a Martinican woman who was a prisoner in Ravensbrück, the Nazi camp for women. The woman in the book draws resilience, the Nazi camp, from imagining her enslaved ancestors. This book was given to me by a friend of mine who's Black and Jewish. I've never seen this book mentioned in any work on the Holocaust. So recently, this man, Joseph Nassi, has attracted some interest in our field. Nassi spent 3 years in German camps. He was born in Suriname, lived mostly in New York, but was arrested in Europe because he had a US passport, so arrested as an alien. During his 3 years in various Nazi camps, Nassi created an incredible visual diary, hundreds of striking images like this one of a prisoner. His work has been the subject of a really fascinating study by Sarah Castile, Black Lives Under Nazism. I've heard Professor Castile talk about this work many times. Always the thing with Holocaust studies audiences that grabs people's attention is what Nassi had with ancestry 3 generations back, hadn't been practiced in the family. Somehow it seems to be that detail makes him legible within the field. Black Germans also merit attention in the framework of the Holocaust. And again, some scholars have worked on this, Camp, Tiffany Florville, and others. One very interesting source I just want to share with you is from the interview of 2 Black German women, sisters. You can see from the title that their father was Cameroonian, so from a German colony, mother a white German. And in the 1980s, they described some of their experiences living in the Nazi system, and we're going to hear it from Ashley.
Times were getting hard. Mother had to look for a new apartment because as a Black man, father wouldn't have got one. We moved into a shabby 3-room flat at the edge of town. Even one of those rooms we rented out. I was signed up at a middle school where I was well received in the beginning. Some teachers remained neutral and friendly. Others made life very hard for me from 1933 on. Often when I came home from school, my mother would notice right away something was wrong. It happened. Then I would cry. She would cry, hold each other tight. Oh, people are so crude to do that to a 14-year-old child. Had to take part in the course on race. Had to listen to statements like God made all whites and blacks half-breeds from the devil. Or half-breeds can only inherit the bad characteristics of both races. The teacher made me go through them with the exhibit, Race and Folk. The exhibit showed, among other things, retouched photos of colored people in Munich whom I knew, filed down teeth and weird facial expressions. It also made me go along on a trip to see a ship, even though I didn't want to. After the trolley ride, we had to march behind the flag. Of course, I walked with my feet down. Barely gotten there, the teacher called me over. Car fare in my hand and said that I had to go home. As a non-Aryan, you can't march with us behind the flag.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that reading. There's many other connections in a global context. Again, scholars are working on really interesting work about Africans in the Holocaust. You see it there, about Holocaust memory in apartheid South Africa, about the impact of Holocaust literature on post-colonial genocide novels in Nigeria in particular. I want to just dwell for a minute on this maybe surprising connection related to the movie Judgment Nuremberg. Again, I got to ask how many people have seen Judgment Nuremberg. Okay, there we got more takers. So you know the movie was released in 1961, right? They rushed it because of the Eichmann trial and a lot of interest in the field. It had its television premiere in the United States in March 1965. You know, in those days, it was always a delay, right, before they put it on TV. On this occasion, ABC made the rare move of interrupting movie, interrupting the programming with breaking news from Selma, Alabama. Breaking news, of course, was police or state troopers attacking marchers for Black voting rights, led by John Lewis and others. The viewers were shocked as the camera suddenly carried right in front of them. Violence, the beating, the people were killed at that event, all in the midst of watching a program that was about the triumph of American democracy and justice. What's more, one strand in the movie, perhaps you remember it, scene with Judy Garland, dealt with a trial of German judges who had been involved in a case of Rassenschande, so racial shame or racial crimes. This was a real case. The character Judy Garland played was based on a woman called Irene Seiler, who, I explain this right, oh yeah, who was brought into a court in the Nazi period because a German Jewish man was accused of having sex with her. The man was executed, right, by the Nazis. And in the trial, judges were brought to trial for that execution. You understand? I didn't tell that in a straightforward way. So in the movie, Judy Garland is testifying in front of an American tribunal. Nazi anti-Semitism is on full display as the German judges, who are charged, hear the story of the case recounted. Misogyny also very present as the German Defense Counsel screams at the Judy Garland character, interrogating her about her behavior years earlier. Did you sit on his lap? At the time, 1965, almost every state in the United States had anti-miscegenation laws. And everywhere, intimacy between Black and white couples was perilous. Another embodied link you can see in the maybe form of friendship. Here depicted in the iconic friendship between Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Luther King. Heschel famously marched at Selma, said, "My feet praying." And both men recognized profound solidarity that connected them. There were also forces that threatened to push them apart. In a 1958 speech, the American Jewish Congress, Martin Luther King articulated those divisive forces, and Lori's going to read it.
The tension building of economic problems were joined by news. Hitler's people's minds and their frustration. The legal and social living time in between
Thank you so much. So these links are inspiring, filling, but not always welcome. When Toni Morrison dedicated her book, Beloved, to the 60 million, was criticized as if she was a Holocaust denier. Scholar of American literature, Danielle Christmas, explained, you can see here, that Morrison's point was not meant to replace Jews, but join them. Christmas herself has worked on Auschwitz and the plantation, very interesting analysis of the interlinking of those themes in American literature. I heard her give a talk on this subject on Zoom, in which she explained the 1978 TV series Holocaust drew heavily on the previous year's epic about slavery, Roots. This was an online talk, and when she made that point, very basic point, the chat immediately lit up with angry comments, dismissing that insight, charging her with appropriating, distorting Holocaust. In fact, the field of Holocaust studies owes a huge debt African-American studies to the civil rights movement, an era precisely in which the field of Holocaust studies emerged in the United States. Think about it, vocabulary like passing, slave labor, even the concept of race was brought into the study of the Holocaust from this context. So I want to close this section by making, again, another obvious point, but easily forgotten, which is that it is actually nothing new to compare or connect the Holocaust to other cases of violence, past and present. There are many different reasons why people make such connections. I've listed some of them there, lots more. And myself, we don't think of all of those reasons. But all of them attest the universal claim of significance of the Holocaust. Now let's go to the last point, the conclusion. Hope that you won't be disappointed that I don't really have a resounding conclusion. I have is a few more quotations, very important ones, some reflections, and a call for us to keep thinking about how anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and misogyny are linked. So the first quotation, again, from William Joshua Heschel, really, I think, a necessary point about despair. I'm going to read it myself. Racism is an evil of tremendous power. God's will transcends all powers. Surrender to despair, surrender to evil. It's important to feel anxiety, sinful to wallow in despair. I want to add a challenge from someone who did not survive the Holocaust. That's this woman, Gustawa Jarecka, Polish Jewish writer in the Warsaw Ghetto, who was killed in Treblinka. Jarecka explained in one of her last writings from 1942 why she devoted her last strength to document the destruction of her community for a future she would not live to see. And Anya will read it for us.
Record must be hurled like a stone under history's wheel in order to stop it. One can lose all hope except one, that the suffering and destruction of this war will make sense when they are looked at from a distant historical perspective. From suffering unparalleled in history, from bloody tears and bloody sweat, a chronicle of days of hell is being composed, which will help explain the historical reasons for why people came to think as they did and why regimes arose that caused such suffering.
Another important challenge closer to us in time and space right now comes from James Baldwin, 1985 book, Evidence of Things Not Seen. Baldwin's analysis, I think, is as incisive today as it was 40 years ago. It's all so important to find the courage to look and to see. Evan will read it.
Relatives of this time and place, this era, is nowhere more clearly revealed than the perpetual attempt to make the public social disaster the result of the issue of single demented creature. Perhaps half a dozen such creatures have, quite incomprehensibly, gone off their rockers and must be murdered or laughed at. Thus, for example, these present days describe a person or group of persons as leftist, a villain, a terrorist, is to dismiss their claims to human attention. They're not compelled to think of them at all anymore, except as the vermin that must be swallowed. In another way, for the same reason, we're still attempting to explain Hitler away I do not wish to see.
Thank you. I also want to thank my colleague Melanie Newton, mentioned earlier, for reminding me, I told her about the title of my talk, revisit this book by James Baldwin. One concept that I found really important is the simple concept of conversation. The importance of thinking together, thinking as an interactive project that involves listening, talking, including those who may say things we don't want to hear. Another concept that was given to me, in his words, by a Holocaust survivor in Toronto, Nate Leipziger, is the concept of commonalities. Leipziger, who survived the Holocaust as a Polish Jewish boy, 11, 12 years old, in a series of camps, connected in recent times with a group of men close to his age who were Indigenous survivors of residential schools in Canada. Nate Leipziger made a number of joint presentations. Some of those men here, Eugene Arcand, Ted Fontaine, others, where they talked about, in Leipziger's words, their common experiences, common trauma, certain common loss. One of their common experiences was sexual abuse, which Leipziger and Arcand both experienced as boys, and which for Leipziger, finding that commonality was what emboldened him after decades of silence, recognized and acknowledged that trauma himself. The idea of commonalities, I think, can be both simple on the surface, and also very deep, even literally deep, thinking about the commonality of death, of graves. I was reminded of this point in 2021, where in Saskatchewan, human remains, a jawbone fragment of a small child, found at the unmarked graves beside a residential school in the Capel Valley. It's the press conference that was held. Couldn't get out of my mind the words from completely different context. The Polish Jewish community leader, Herman Kruk, kept a diary while actually was in Vilna ghetto, wrote, "Over the graves of murdered children, poison flowers grow." Thinking about that image, about the long legacies of violence, about the hard-fought life, even beauty, still managed to wrest out of those situations, struck me as an important and significant commonality. In commonalities, perhaps we can see the possibility of solidarity. Thinking about solidarity, again, I've been so haunted by a poem written in 2014, the Palestinian poet Naiwan Barwith, who remembers Armenians, taking that line again, which many of you probably know comes from Hitler's taunt in 1939, as the Germans prepared to invade Poland. Monica will read it.
Remember him. I ride the nightmare hospital.
The last word in this talk, I want to turn to someone who is not famous, doesn't have maybe the eloquence of a poet, who speaks with hesitation, with self-consciousness, with the uncertainty of a person thinking, not knowing how to express their insight. That's this woman, Mary Levy, survivor from Bulgaria, Holocaust survivor from Bulgaria, interviewed in the mid-1990s. Julia will read it.
I always wonder what it would have been as a person, as a human being, if I didn't have a little bit of suffering in my life. Thank God we weren't killed and all that. It just helped me so much to become a human being. I know that today I cannot say about the blacks, just the yellows. I cannot say anything because I know how deprived I felt when they was in power were against me. This maybe helps a little bit. I don't know. Maybe it's a crazy thing to say.
Thank you. And let's end on that note. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we've got at least 30 minutes for Q&A. Taking questions from the room. Have a question, you need the microphone, and don't do as I did with my introduction. Speak closely to the mic so the audience can hear you. Sorry, online audience, does not have the microphone close enough to my mouth. And Kalani will take care of the online questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring you the microphone. Next questions.
I just want to interject to say I'm hard of hearing. So that's why I'm asking to make sure the microphone also helps the online audience. I might ask my friend Tim to repeat the question.
Jason Dawsey. So let me thank you, Professor Bergen, for a really excellent talk. And actually, I think mine are really more comments. It's a couple of things you made me think about. There was so much in there, and I guess I'm still processing most of it. But just two things you made me think about, which I think it's good for all of us to be aware of, is that we're learning a lot more too about people in resistance activity. Anti-Nazi resistance activity, for example, from Suriname, in the French Caribbean, who were swept up in the Nazi camps. At the very local level, people who were working at Bergen Belsen or at Mauthausen or other sites are telling us a lot more about these individuals whose they were targeted by the Nazis for two reasons: their politics, usually on the far left, and their race. So I think what you're pointing us to is making us aware of these links, how much we still don't know about these cases, even though they've been available for a while. And your points here at the end about solidarity, I'm a hopeless historian as well of modern Germany. And I do often think about the fact that the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, in 1891, its manifesto, Erfurt, where the city was written at, but it talks about combating all forms of oppression. 1891. So it was a party that talked about anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools already very early on. August Bebel had a women's movement talking about not only just women's suffrage, but women's emancipation. First, the SPD played a big role in at least trying to stop genocide in Namibia in 1904, 1905. So remember, too, there have been people who stood up against these things for a while, and we should not forget them as well. So thank you for your time. Thank you.
I don't have too much to say in response except to thank you for that comment. I want to just pick up on one thing that you said, say, you know, I think it's such an important point about resistance because like, when you study history, you actually listen to people, you see all those different ways that, oh yeah, like asserted, you know, I'm still here, or, you know, in spite of this, I'm going to try to make something possible, or, you know, so I think that is really important, and it's why we need the sources generated from people on the receiving end of the violence. Then the second point about, you know, not being almost like arrogant, like, oh, you know, we've learned so much and we're so progressive compared to our, you know, poor predecessors in the past who didn't understand anything. Studying history can be very humbling. You realize people figured out so many things that I think, oh, I just discovered this for myself. So yeah, just the reminder that, you know, yeah, we live in that continuum.
So much, Doris. That was just brilliant. Thank you. And so I haven't really thought through it now to articulate it clearly, but I'm struggling with essentialization of the notion of anti-Semitism. This idea of longest hatred that is always there eternally. I was a little concerned that the sort of metaphor of the dust ball sort of fits into that. It's always there like a plasma, which was there in the history, and then it sort of loses the historical specificity, particularity. And I'm always sort of how to think about particularity.
So thank you. That is, I think it's a really important point and set of observations. And I think mean, I've been struggling with this. I'll tell you, my dust ball, I think actually does much better in avoiding some of that essentializing. But the talk that I've done a lot of times for teachers, that's called the challenges of teaching about anti-Semitism. The way I have that talk structure, it's like a dialectical structure. So like each time you're like, okay, one of the problems is, how do we talk about it without reproducing it? Well, you have to historicize it. But then when you historicize it, you end up with that essentialism, the longest hatred. Easily turns into, well, there must be something about Jews. So everyone in every society has always hated them. And there's got to be something, and that is like a terrible dead end. But to me, it seems like then that issue is countered where you think, no, you've got to think connectively, right? So, but then that could be countered by, well, yeah, but what about the particularities? Anti-Semitism is different than anti-Black racism, and it is different in those different settings. So I think like that endless process where, you know what I mean? Like you're moving from one sort of problem to another. It's another problem that, comes out with that issue of, making the links or making the comparisons. People are like, okay, you lose the specificity. Then me, one of the antidotes is there to factor in thinking about religion. That wasn't something I focused on in this talk, but the role of Christianity is so particular. The way anti-Semitism is structured, changes, and so on, then that creates another problem. Depending on your audience and where you're teaching, how do you talk about that without just alienating the audience? So for me, that problem of talking about anti-Semitism is a multi-layered and complex problem. And I think it has to be approached on those multiple different ways. But I do think it's a sort of intractable problem. I don't know. And the reason, I guess I'll just say it openly, I think anti-Semitism, if it's not talked about in conjunction with other forms of prejudice and hatred, really does become a sort of tunnel vision or a self-fulfilling kind of story. And I do think those contexts are so essential. So yeah, basketball, maybe it's not perfect, but I think it's better than something that's always the exact same, the same shape, same, right? Because it can look really different. It does literally come. What else has it without room? Yes.
Hey, we've got a question from another fellow University of Toronto graduate, Michael Ostling, who teaches at the Bergen College here. We've got a Toronto in-gathering here.
I have I guess it's a question or more of a worry also from the perspective of a teacher. So I'm really struck by that powerful quotation, over the graves of murdered children, frozen floors. So there are murdered children, right? In Vilno or in Saskatchewan. Then there's the discourse of the murdered child. So murder, Pizzagate. How do we teach our students to, it's not different, right? The fantasy murdered child, which enables genocide, and the real murdered child that we need to pay attention to.
It's a really, really, really important question. And by the way, it's the same as with the raped woman's body. Same as, right, the sort of women and children, like you say, as something that an image that can be weaponized and harnessed. I mean, the only answer I have in a way is the answer that's already built into your question. You know what I mean? It's like you have to teach people by showing different sources, by listening, by trying to see how those discourses, you know what I mean, function in time and space. And it's really difficult because, for example, I was thinking about the residential schools and the unmarked graves. Now I receive in my email inbox regularly, like at least once a month. I think because I'm on the Jewish Studies faculty, I don't know why. Emails from some person who says this is all a hoax. No Indigenous children were killed at those schools. No, this is just like a DEI hoax trying to get, da da da. And yeah, the answer is like in a world where we're swamped with this weaponization and all that, not talking about it doesn't help. You know what I mean? How to help people sort through that? I mean, think do what you can, bringing those accounts, bringing them from people and trying to help. Like, yeah, how do you sort through propaganda and the soundbite from wrenching experiences? It's one small thing that came to me. I teach a course, which Tim mentioned, religion and violence, first-year students. They can pick all kinds of different cases, to work on, and try to help them make these distinctions. One of the things that I say to them, it's ridiculous, but is that the sources should always be as long and complete as possible. So in other words, watch out for the soundbite. You know what I mean? And I think this kind of a distinction is quite valuable to say, if there's an interview and it's 2 hours long, listen to the whole interview. If all you got is the 30-second soundbite, maybe you have to wonder. Then always ask yourself, who took that interview? Who paid for it to be disseminated, right? To think about like who is curating those accounts of human suffering. But I think it's a huge challenge and it's only sadly getting worse. That's the best I can do.
Question on maybe why you decided to end the presentation with a quote like this. That's because this one resonates with me particularly because I feel like in the world that we're in right now, we are in a bit of a crisis, especially with just sort of propaganda and what is that on this quote, because I do believe that if you have particularly suffering in your life, eyes are open to injustices and things that can happen in the world. And I think that we're certainly at a point with a lot of the hate that's right now, where we may need to suffer a little bit more to be able to actually take action against the things that are happening and in order to prevent things like Holocaust.
So I missed the very first sentence. Sorry, my hearing is really bad. Can you start
I
over?
was curious as to why you decided to end the presentation on a post like this, because it kind of introduces the idea of suffering to be able to combat or understand it more.
Yeah, so are you asking why I ended with this one? Yeah. What I love about it is her self-reflection and her uncertainty, right? Where she is not saying, and I think it actually does go to your question too, like it's not that certainty, like, because I suffered, I now know. It's saying, I don't really know how that affected me. And also maybe it wasn't even that bad. Some certainty I feel like is so important. Maybe it does go to that question of how you almost sort out the thing about the sound bites or the weaponized stories of suffering. There's so often such a certainty, such a clarity. And here the idea of like, I'm actually not so sure. Even the sort of discourse of like, how do we learn how to prevent it? I've thought about this a lot, and I know there's people involved here too, like field of Holocaust studies and genocide studies too. It's always justified. We study in order to prevent, right? That's always like how people justify. But is that really the reason to study the Holocaust? Like if you think about the quotation like that Anya read by Gustava Yareska, she's like, maybe we study it because it's important to try to understand, like these were the lives and deaths of people and they mattered and they're not just garbage like that gets, thrown aside. That's really different from saying, well, now I know what I have to do. Now I know, what cause I'm going to support or who I'm going to vote for. Or I don't believe there is that kind of certainty that comes out of history. You know what I mean? Like, I think lesson is the lesson of like trying to like acknowledge the value of human lives. But then does that tell you, oh, Now I can prevent it because I see these warning signals and I know what to do. You know, I see it, I mean, in the Holocaust all the time of people who understood really well what is coming. Knowing that does not, sadly, give you an instruction sheet. How you have to do this, you know? So yeah, I think I mean, if you want to like the insight of connection with human beings is feel at least more powerful and maybe less prone to manipulation and a kind of certainty of, oh, this is the lesson. Now I know, now I know exactly what I need to do. And now I know who's the enemy and who's the good guys, you know? So maybe not a good answer, but I'm really glad you asked that because I'll back up and say, the reason I even found this quote had a number of undergraduate work study students listening to Shoah Foundation interviews. You know, there's like tens of thousands of those. And like, I don't know, I give them very general instructions because like, I don't know what you're looking for because you're going to find what's interesting. But one time I had to give a talk. It was also one of those Holocaust Education Week themes. I can't remember what the theme was, but I gave one student, Masha Koyama, the instruction. I was like, those interviews, they always end with the people that ask, what lessons? You know, what do you think you want to say to, you know, say different things. Often they say things like, you know, love my grandchildren and let's be grateful every day. Sometimes they say things like, you know, Israel's the hope for the Jewish, but they say all different kinds of things. This is what this woman, you know, and yeah. So that idea of, you know, not having clear-cut message, but thinking maybe it's a call for reflection and introspection. So that was important.
We have one online question from one of my excellent Religion 381 students, Religion and Moral Issue. I think a lot of young people think about this, especially at Thanksgiving. As a young person, how can we most efficiently start harder conversations with our older family members, especially when there's significant power dynamics at play? A lifetime of learned and internalized negative belief systems to work against.
I wish I knew how to answer that
I got great
question.
students.
So important. And, you know, I wish I knew how to answer that question, but don't, because the only thing that I know is that families are so important to these conversations, but they often are the hardest place to have those conversations. And it's so easy to say things like, you know, I've got to lead with love. But then what? So I don't know. I really so impressed by this question and what it shows about the person's caring and trying to keep that connection with their family. So I feel like that attitude is probably the best hope that you can have for that. But yeah, good luck. It's those, yeah, family, power dynamics. I hear all that.
Yeah, just a comment, but to me, evident. I wasn't going to say this because I'm curious, but it seems like the discussion we're having. Strength in numbers. I'm a historian, and like as a Chapultec, I worry about the particularities at the time when we prejudice. All of these things come together in solidarity, we can make social change. And during this period, happen.
I want to just like applaud exactly that because you think, yeah, exactly, there's a time and the place to say we really have to focus on specificities. And then there's a time and a place where like, we got to find solidarity and the common cause. And people do find it at those really basic, you know, connections. And I just realized I have something to say that a tiny bit to the previous question based on, again, students in my religion and violence class. So we have these small workshop groups where the students, you know, workshop their progress, like their drafts. One year I had a group of students, 3 students, 1 Muslim student, 1 international student from Korea, and 1 like Canadian student, Christian background from, Western Canada. And the one student, the Western Canada student, had written a play about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Like that was her project. And the other 2 students were giving her, feedback. So she began, she would like apologized and said, I really got stuck. I was finding it, felt I couldn't muster like the words. And I felt like, was I appropriating people's experience by trying to write about that? So then, one of the other students said to her, the Korean student who was also Christian background said, the thing is with these issues, you have to write about the silence because the silence is really the core of the story. So, rather than trying to find, you have to write about the silence. She said, I can tell you because she said, I wouldn't say in my own congregation, but she's like, I've seen things like this. Also. The thing is that it's about, it's about the silence. Then the other student, the Muslim student, said, exactly. She was like, I also would say, it's not, I'm lost exactly, but I just know when these things happen, you can't tell any, you can't tell your parents, you can't tell your teachers, you can't tell, and they're like, exactly. Sitting there like so blown away. I thought, wait a second, did these people all just basically tell me something about their own experience or the experience of people so close to them about what they had received in terms of like listen, whatever, and like a bond and that, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think those possibilities for solidarity, they appear, surprising times. I was blown away by that. Inconclusive maybe story, but really a healing moment of how people can connect and maybe build on that. We did a good job on those papers, either in that practical way, built on that one.
Okay, we got another question from the audience.
So much. And thank you for this, Dr. Bergen. This is very insightful. And I was really struck by you, this point that you made about like connecting and bringing together the commonalities and the shared histories that the different oppressed groups might have together. I guess my question with that is, like, how do we make good connections and comparisons, but also kind of reveal the tensions that might be in there as well? Like, how do, like, as educators and as folks who are like in the field to doing maybe many different things, how do we like present the intricacies and the specifics with, without flattening them or just making them incomparable?
No. Same thing. I wish I had a really good answer. I wish I had a really good answer to that. I'm going to have a little bit of the answer of, maybe this helped a little bit. I mean, the first thing is, I think no matter who like we are or who I am, got to be prepared that, people might not want to talk, might not want to share those views, and they might not trust. You know what I mean? So I think that is already one thing. Like, it's not like a magical thing that, everybody is going to feel better us bring things out in the open. I think that's one thing that's really important, is to not have like the magical expectations. There's so much stuff on Twitter, like changing people's lives and like the transformative and all that. What's a huge amount of pressure that is often, you know what I mean? Just unrealistic. I think one thing is to maybe just like start small and like with those really individual, even, one-on-one conversations, and not have a real dramatic expectation. And then things will sometimes take you by surprise when they come out. But the other thing is, I guess really to, expect that people maybe come from such different places. And again, if I can give a specific example. So I've been involved with this project. It's going to be published as a book about universalizing the Holocaust. And, like trying to find all these different approaches that think about, the Holocaust from different angles. And one of the contributors to that project, book will come out soon, edited by Edward Kissy and Norman Goda, is a South Asian scholar based in India, Anjali Roy, and she wrote an essay about using the Shoah Foundation template to interview survivors of violence and partition in India. And she wrote in there something like, like in the 1990s and early 2000s, this was such a popular idea. So many South Asian scholars are like, yeah, we're going to almost like use this model to do interviews, and it's going to really be so helpful to break open the silence around, especially sexual violence, rape. So many women, endured that. That Professor Roy wrote, said, looking back now on the work that people had done, including herself, said, I can see that some of this was a violation. That framework did not fit. That many women in those communities did not help them. Like the idea that, talking about it is going to free you up or whatever. She said it wasn't necessarily true. Some of them, it was not what they needed at all. Felt really re-traumatized by that experience. And, she said it also didn't necessarily produce even good historical results. Because when people are uncomfortable, they pull out a cliche of their back pocket. You know what I mean? And then they say the answer that they think the interviewer wants to hear. They might give even like very nationalist, kind of narrative that would fit all that. It was so just, I don't know, good for me to read that. Think, yeah, you don't necessarily know what people need or whatever people want. And you can't assume, well, this is what's good for me. Nate Leipziger, it was liberating. Talks about that sexual violence and to hear those community leaders stand up like on national TV, talk openly about what they endured. And I think particularly for men, like it had different resonance, it was really important. But for the people Anjali Roy was talking about, it wasn't. So I think that somehow is a complicated answer, but yeah, not to expect too much. And to try to listen.
Okay, we have time for at least one more question or comment. Bibliography.
Bibliography.
Yeah, there's some resources that they could read. We could obviously pass that on. But
Yeah, well,
speak to
because
that.
the thing is, there's a lot of books that I put on those slides. So, we could definitely share those. And just another thing, one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about, I think it's really important in the field also. I mentioned it in passing, but his work gets cited and quoted, and his work just gets erased, forgotten. And like, see it all the time, and now I think it's even more because with the online searching and that, the same names come up over and over and over again. Even something so basic as thinking like, if I want to talk about, if I want to talk about Black victims of Nazism, can I find some work that's written by a Black scholar instead of quoting the white person who quotes all the Black scholars and puts it in their book? So I think bibliography is actually a really important site of trying to like open up the field. Footnotes and that it's capital. You know what I mean? Like people get their promotions and all that, their tenure. Someone's looking at, I can give an example. Can I end with one example? So, yeah. So one of the books I showed on there by Edward Kissy called Africans in the Holocaust. Super interesting book. There, he's a historian of Africa. And he analyzed newspapers, diplomatic correspondence, from African leaders in like 6 different countries, West Africa 3 and East Africa 3. And he found like 13 interest in following the events of the Holocaust from all different angles. Very, very interesting book. It's completely original. Nobody has talked about this or published it. Kissy's book, at one point, I don't know, he was up for some kind of, issue, and someone said like, Google Scholar, hardly have any citations of the book. It's like, that's because book is breaking such new ground. You know what I mean? Like, it's not going to pop up in every single search. So sometimes things that are highly original, that are really coming from people doing completely new work, end up just disappearing. So yeah, you can use footnotes and the bibliography in some real work.
Okay, last call. One of my students.
I was just wondering what your opinion would be then, kind of harkening back to when you mentioned like the weaponization of using women and children as victims, and this concept of, you know, kind of that openness and indecisiveness. If that is at all related or harmful in kind of the similar prospect of how making stories such as the Holocaust a story about good and evil, you know, having certain heroes and perpetrators, if that at all kind of connected, I guess.
That is interesting, and I hope I'm understanding it right. Like, you mean, yeah, like the idea that the Holocaust is this universal story of good and evil. You know, yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think the universal significance is maybe simplified into that form. There is maybe, yeah, a deeper universal significance, which is that history of violence and suffering, and like is every human being's history. And it plays out in specific ways in these different settings. But yeah, I think you're so right that this kind of idea of uncertainty, it doesn't map well onto, you know, a simple notion of like, well, people just had to stand up for what was right. But when you look at so many circumstances, including in the Holocaust, it's like, it's not really what the situation is like. People living under oppressive season, you know, under repressive regimes year after year after year. It's not always so clear what's the right and what's the wrong. So it doesn't mean to say there's no such thing as right and wrong. As people trying to maintain some kind of decency, maybe it goes to that first question about the resistance, that sometimes it's more like bringing it down to a human level, you know, of thinking, how do people try to maintain integrity, to live with decency in, you know, a world that's saturated with violence? Those aren't easy questions, but maybe there's something in those individual accounts that can help you hold on to that.
I guess that about does it. So thank you, Professor Bergen, for being here, giving that fantastic talk, and
Thank you all.